welcome to all of you. You all know what we're here for. Are you sure this is on, Tom? I don't sound as great as usual. Does this? Can you all hear me? Okay. All right. So, welcome to our lecture tonight. And you know we have our favorite rabbi with us. Our favorite rabbi, who is a teacher at ODU and Virginia Wesleyan University. And you all know this, so I'm not going to talk any more about him except to say how very grateful we are that he has come to talk to us about Ivanhoe tonight. I don't know about you, I didn't care for the movie, but I will be interested to hear what he has to say about it. So, don't we love this expression? Oh, Jean, aren't you going to entertain us first with all these chairs out? No. Okay. So then I can call our favorite rabbi up now? Okay.
Thank you. Always get such a wonderful introduction. You know, it's going to spoil me. Good evening, friends. It's always nice to be back here. I can tell you that I was worried about getting here today because I had an additional assignment on the Norfolk side of the water, which kept me there until 5 p.m. And I was dreading the thought of fighting the bridge tunnel traffic at 5 p.m., but it wasn't so bad. And I was here before 6 o'clock and able to rest up and get ready for the conversation. Can't hear me? Okay, I'll speak a little louder and maybe I'll hold this closer. Does that help? Yeah. Does that help? Yeah. Someone sitting in the back row, raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay, that's a good sign. If I say raise your hand if you can't hear me and you raise your hand, that'll be that would be in self-incrimination. Friends, there are several interlocking topics that I want to discuss tonight. The Ivanhoe movie is one of them. The Ivanhoe novel on which the movie is based is a second. And the actual history, which is fictionalized, is the main topic. So I think I'll start with the novel and not spend much time on it. 1819, the popular British novelist Sir Walter Scott published Ivanhoe, big, fat novel. And Ivanhoe was very popular in its day. Tales of brave knights and beautiful fair maidens and jousting, right? Battle scenes, romance scenes, you name it, Ivanhoe has it. So it was very popular in its day. I would guess that Sir Walter Scott was probably the most famous British novelist in the generation maybe right after Jane Austen and before Charles Dickens, in that brief period of time. Very popular author. Now, from my own perspective, the novel Ivanhoe is indispensable in one particular way. For those of you who know your English literature, I'll do a little bit of a review. Can you think of a favorable portrayal of a Jewish character in English fiction prior to Ivanhoe? I cannot. The two most famous ones that come to mind are the Prioresse's tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. You might remember Geoffrey Chaucer, the first great poet of the medieval English period, around the year 1400, writes this story of several dozen pilgrims setting out in the springtime to go to Canterbury to pay homage at the grave of the sainted martyr St. Thomas à Becket, who was the archbishop who was murdered by the henchmen of King Henry II. By the way, he was the father of both King Richard and King John in this movie. Their father had been very friendly with Thomas à Becket, but when Thomas à Becket became the archbishop, they were quarreling over church versus state issues, and finally the king in his exasperation said, will no one rid me of this churchman? And someone took him seriously and killed the guy. So he was sainted, and the pilgrims would go year by year to visit his tomb and expect that God's grace would envelop them for that act of piety. So that's the setting of Chaucer's very important poem, and each of the travelers tells a story as they go on their way. There's one traveler who is a head nun in a nunnery. She's the prioress, and she tells an anti-Semitic story of the Jews who murder a little boy for his blood for Passover matzahs, which is a terrible thing. It's the blood libel. It's totally false, but it was popular in its day. It caused many anti-Jewish riots. It is still popular in Arab anti-Jewish propaganda. It's still circulated as if it's true. And it shows up in Chaucer. The little boy's name was Hugh of Lincoln. Lincoln was the town in England where a little boy was found murdered, not because of foul satanic rituals. Unfortunately, he was murdered, which is a sad enough thing, but not for the reasons they said. The next very famous portrayal of a Jewish character, and I'll bet more of you know this, is by William Shakespeare, and that is Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Shylock, who demands his pound of flesh. Remember that? And in the end, he is bested, and his daughter converts to marry her Christian boyfriend, and he's utterly dejected. So that's the next very famous, or shall I say infamous, characterization of Jews in English literature. There are others equally negative. There was a play by Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare, called The Jew of Malta, which is just the worst kind of anti-Semitism. There are no favorable portrayals of Jews until Rebecca of York and her father Isaac of York in this novel, Ivanhoe. So even if the novel is long and if it's a bit tedious in places and if it's not exactly the style of novel we read today, I honor it for that. And by the way, there were not many other Jewish favorable characters in 19th century British literature. The next most famous portrayal of a Jew in 19th century English literature is also very negative, and I'll bet you know it. It's in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, and it's the character of the chief pickpocket, Fagin. Remember? Fagin, who is teaching all his child wards to pick a pocket or two, right? So Jews get a very rough treatment in English literature in the main. It begins to get better in the 20th century. And intriguingly enough, the first really positive treatment of a Jewish character is in a book which is very hard to read because it follows the stream of consciousness. It's by James Joyce. Remember that name? James Joyce. It's called Ulysses. And it's the story of a couple of people who intersect in Dublin in, I think, 1916. And there's a younger one named Stephen Dedalus, who is the main protagonist of Ulysses. And he has a kind of an older mentor named Leopold Bloom, a Jewish character, favorably depicted. But really, Sir Walter Scott's portrayals of Isaac of York, and especially his daughter Rebecca of York, stand out as being far more brave than almost anything in its day and age. So for that reason, although it's not the best novel ever, I very much appreciate the novel of Ivanhoe. Now I'll turn to the movie of it. Did everyone see the movie in the last week or two? Okay, it's a very 1950s kind of a movie. First of all, the Technicolor, that kind of drenched color, just tells you 1950s. The musical score tells you 1950s. And the way in which they portray the characters is also very much over the top, so to speak, right? But the basic idea is that this Norman knight, Bois de Gilbert, notice it's a French name, right? By the way, the French names are just extravagant. My favorite French name for a knight is the guy who dies in the burning building, Front de Boeuf. It sounds like something you might get in the grill over here. I'd like my Front de Boeuf medium rare, please. It sounds like that. But anyway, the Bois Gilbert, who's the last character, Ivanhoe knocks off the other ones pretty quickly, but Bois Gilbert is the most formidable opponent. He's the one who dies at the very end. And it turns out that he is smitten with the beauty of Rebecca of York, or shall we say Elizabeth Taylor. And may I say it was an inspired casting choice to cast the virtually unknown 17-year-old actress Elizabeth Taylor, virtually unknown then, as Rebecca of York. She crushed the role, as they say, and she set a generation of male hearts, needing their nitroglycerin. Must have been the violet eyes, I don't know. So, in the film, we have several conflicts working out in parallel. One is the conflict between quote-unquote good King Richard and bad King John, right? Who are actually brothers. Richard is the oldest son of Henry II, King Henry II Plantagenet, and John is his third son. There's a second son, Geoffrey. If you want to see a very different portrayal of them, but probably more accurate, I recommend a very fine film great cast, starring Peter O'Toole as the aged King Henry II, and Katharine Hepburn, great actress, as his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, she the mother of Richard and John. So it's called The Lion in Winter. Very, very fine novel. It's a play, and then it becomes a movie. You could also see a movie about the young Henry II, played by Peter O'Toole again, a younger Peter O'Toole, and Richard Burton playing Archbishop Thomas à Becket. And that's simply called Becket. Also a play which was then made into a movie. That would be a great double feature. In fact, Becket and then Lion in Winter. And then if you want an epilogue, you can watch Ivanhoe. So one is the conflict between Richard and John. I will tell you what the real history of it was in a moment. Then you have another parallel conflict between Normans and Saxons. Were you aware of that? You got this guy Cedric, who's a Saxon nobleman, and Wilfrid of Ivanhoe is his son. At first estranged because he followed the Norman king on crusade, and then part of the story is the reconciliation between father and son. And you have a little bit of a love triangle. You know, his true love is Rowena. They even did that, you know, kimosabi thing that, you know, they became blood bonded. But is he going to be able to resist the lovely Rebecca or not? Especially after she heals him from a near mortal injury. So Joan Fontaine's character, Rowena, confesses that she's jealous, but all is well at the end, right? He marries his blonde Saxon goddess. And Rebecca goes off with her father to someplace where Jews go off to. So that's another conflict. And then there's this business about Rebecca's life is endangered because of several unworthy desires. John's grasping desire for power and money, and Bois de Gilbert's lustful desire for Rebecca. I mean, after all, how does he know her? They hadn't even had one cup of ice cream at the cafe. So how could they possibly know each other? All he knows is that she's smitten him, right? And as he's dying, he says, "I love you, I've always loved you." Yeah. How long has always been, right? Well, maybe it was love at first sight. So, putting it all together, we have this film which wants to play upon the obvious advantages of a historical novel. It wants the visual treat of fight scenes. And you have them aplenty. You have the long scene where Robin Hood's archers besiege a castle. By the way, does that strike you as plausible? There's no way that archers, unsupported by knights, could take a castle. How could they possibly? They could drive the defenders to take cover, but there's no way they can get into the castle. So that's pure Hollywood for you. Pure Hollywood. Although we should say that Sir Walter Scott's novel was largely responsible for the legend of Robin Hood. So it is at least faithful to the novel in that respect. Also, what did you make of the jousting? How did that strike you as authentic?
It happened too fast.
Medieval conflict was terribly bloody and unromantic. Unromantic in the extreme. And somehow this is supposed to look like it's chivalry and, you know, somehow lovely, and he puts the crown of beauty on someone and he salutes someone. That's all way too civilized for who those people really were. Let me tell you a little bit more of what 12th century reality was like. The lady nobles tried to use this new fad called chivalry to teach the menfolk certain things. The first order of business was to teach the menfolk to get off their horses before they rode into the dining hall. Because think of it, this is a castle. It has a huge keep, right? The dining hall is probably twice the size of this room, with enormous arches to get in. So the knights were fighting men on horseback, and their ladies tried to teach them to walk into the dining room instead of riding in. Because, you know, when you ride in, the horses ride in, and the horses do what horses do. In the dining room. And I'm not talking Moose Tracks ice cream. King Henry himself tried to teach his barons to use forks when they ate. They didn't know from forks. Forks were a French invention. Only sissies used forks. You know, they had their daggers and they, you know, trenchermen like that. Actually, the Saxon guy is eating in a somewhat historically appropriate way. Remember that? And then he feeds his dog too. And then he pets the dog with one hand, and he pets his gesture with the same greasy hand. That part was historically a little bit more accurate. So this is a romantic fantasy from start to finish. But in some ways a lovely one. Walter Scott was one of those people who created the popular image of the Middle Ages. In days of old when knights were bold, right? That's a creation of this novel Ivanhoe and some similar works. The Middle Ages really were much, much grittier, not romantic at all. But the movie is brave in other ways too. In some ways, the movie reminds me of other films we've seen from the 1950s that try to strike a certain religious tone, or late 1940s. For example, do you know the film Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck? Anyone ever see that film? 1947, just 5 years before this film. Gentleman's Agreement, Gregory Peck portrays a very successful magazine writer who's looking for an article to write that will really seize the conscience of the nation. And he decides to impersonate a Jew for a few weeks or a month or however long it takes and see what it feels like. And he goes to a place like, I don't know, what would be an example here? The Chamberlain Hotel? It would be the Cavalier down in Virginia Beach, where Jews were simply not welcomed. Do any of you remember those days in these parts where certain hotels, just Jewish people did not join them? No Jews in the Norfolk Yacht Club, that sort of thing. They'd be blackballed, right? So the reality was that a Jew and a Saxon knight never shook hands in friendship. The scene where Isaac of York shakes hands with Wilfred of Ivanhoe because they were agreeing on the ransom, and he says, I've never shaken hands with a Saxon knight in friendship. Well, I never have was true. I'm doing it now is the movie. So that allows me to get to my main theme, which is what was the position of the Jewish people in that part of the world that back then was called Latin Christendom. It wasn't called Europe. So let's understand what is Christendom and what is Latin Christendom. Christendom is the countries where Christianity was the law of the land, established by political and military might. What was the opposing force? The House of Islam, which was the series of lands that were conquered. Okay, this is not voluntary conversion, this is conquest. Conquered by force of Arab arms. Starting in the 600s, the Arab armies exploded out of Arabia, conquered the entire ancient Persian Empire completely, conquered most of the Byzantine Empire, conquered all of North Africa, and up through Gibraltar into Spain, conquered most of Spain. If you remember the movie El Cid, that takes place in the Christian versus Muslim warfare in Spain. That warfare lasted for 775 years. Christians versus Muslims in Spain. That's how long they fought. In Spanish, it's called the Reconquista, the reconquest. And so to be members of these opposing faiths was almost automatically to be at war. Now, most of the Jews of the world in the early Middle Ages lived in the House of Islam. They lived in places like the old Persian Empire, conquered by Islam. They lived in the old Byzantine Empire, conquered by Islam. They lived in North Africa, conquered by Islam. And starting in about the 800s, they began living in large numbers in Spain, conquered by Islam. Very, very few Jews lived under Christian rule in the early Middle Ages. How did they get there? Well, I'll explain. One of the features of Christian life in the early Middle Ages was its intense localism. The Roman Empire was gone in the West, and with it, any thought that the Mediterranean was a safe place to travel. Without the Roman Navy, nothing protected cargo ships from pirates. So the Pax Romana didn't exist anymore. Life shrank to very local units. Now, oftentimes it was just a matter of survival. This is where feudalism comes in. You've got Arab armies invading from the south. You've got Norse armies invading from Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and they're Vikings. They're fearsome. You've got Magyars and Slavic armies invading from the east. The entire continent, the entire Christian part of the continent is under siege. And they're just barely surviving. Gradually, they begin to get some more centers of power. And the first big center of Christian power was in modern-day France and Germany, all under the rule of an emperor named Carolus Magnus, Karl the Great, or as we call him, Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne also had a sweetheart deal with the Pope. The popes were the bishops of Rome, and they were like princes controlling that district. The part of Italy just to the north of them was attacking them militarily. Anyone know anyone whose last name is Lombardi? Did you know the football coach Vince Lombardi? Lombardy is a section of Italy, right? Just north of Rome. The Lombards, whose original name was Langobard, right? You get the idea? Right. They were a Germanic tribe who settled in north-central Italy, and they were pressing on the papal state. Now, to their north and west is the kingdom of the Franks. So starting with Charlemagne's father, whose name was Pepin, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, made a sweetheart deal. If you take care of the Langobards and get them off my back, I will make you not just mayor of the palace, I'll make you king of the Franks. Because the kings were a group of people called the Merovingians, descended from a man named Clovis. And they had lost their verve. They were mostly shadowy figures, and the mayors of the palace were really the power behind the throne. So in the year 751, the Pope and Pepin come up with a deal, set aside the last Merovingian king. By the way, they gave him the Samson treatment. These kings had long hair. That was a sign of their divine grace. So gave him a haircut. It's a lot less than he might have given him. I mean, he might have cut other things off too, but he cut his hair off. And the king was packed off to a monastery, and Pepin became the king. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, resumes the attack against the Lombards and becomes the king of the Lombards, which puts him in Italy in the 770s, where he meets Jewish people. And he thinks, I can use them. Now, what can he use them for? I'll tell you. In a world where trade is almost disrupted because Muslim armies control the south of the Mediterranean, and to go from the south of the Mediterranean to the north of the Mediterranean is crossing a war zone. Trade is very, very difficult. On the other hand, the Jewish people are like neutrons. They're not electrons, they're not protons. They don't have a state. They're not an enemy state to the Muslims. They're not an enemy state to the Christians. They're like Switzerland. so they could be kind of like intermediaries. So Charlemagne wants to use the Jewish people for the long-range trade that has been disrupted by the Arab armies. Now, did the Jewish people have the assets to be able to do that? The answer is very interesting. By the 700s or 800s, all Jews, almost all Jews, are what we call rabbinic Jews. There are a few called Karaites, but mostly they are rabbinic Jews, which means they have an agreed upon way of reading the Bible and applying it to questions of law and governance and society. So they self-governed by the rabbinic understanding of the Bible. They were never independent. They didn't have countries and states. But within their communities, they settled their own affairs by having their own courts, where the rabbis applied the Bible to court cases. So that was the formula for Jewish survival in the Middle Ages. They were loyal to whoever was the king of the country. But what they wanted to do was the opportunity to run their own internal affairs. So that means that a Jew living in the Muslim part of the world, let's say Cairo, who wanted to have some dealings with a Jew living in the Christian part of the world, let's say Naples, if they could get a shipload of cargo from one to the other, they had the same law, which is the rabbinic understanding of Bible law. They had the same language, because if they didn't speak Hebrew, right, if the Cairoene Jew spoke Arabic in his daily life, and the Neapolitan Jew spoke Old Italian in his daily life, they nonetheless spoke Hebrew for prayer. And their rabbis were fluent in Hebrew. So someone could go to the rabbi and say, write a business letter, please, about so many bales of cotton, Egyptian cotton, that we're sending to Naples for thus and such a price. The rabbi could write it in Hebrew. The rabbi in Naples could read it in Hebrew, translate it to the street language of the merchant in Naples, and they could conduct their trade. And if they had a disagreement, as sometimes happens in business, they had agreed upon legal standards and agreed upon judges. Nowhere else in the Middle Ages did they have that. In England, did you have the Baron's justice or the King's justice? Even within one country, you couldn't get an agreement on how to resolve something in court, let alone if it's in England and France. If you have English wool from your English sheep and you're sending it to Belgium, right, for them to process into dyed textiles, and there's some disagreement, is it ruled by the laws of the King of England or is it ruled by the Holy Roman Empire? It's so hard to do business under those terms. So the Jewish people, because of their minority status, were able to become the long-range merchants for the Christians. Now, more so under the rule of the children and grandchildren of Charlemagne, Jewish people began getting invited into France. And generally they stayed in very tight communities, not across the countryside, but in cities, because they were meant to be import-export agents for the nobility. In other words, they didn't have a quote-unquote right to live there. They had a utility. They served at the pleasure of the rulers. This didn't make them very popular, right? Most peasants don't love their rulers, despite what that movie shows. When did they get to England? Well, the answer is, since they're part of this feudal world, when William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, some Jewish people followed him there. He was Norman. He didn't like Jews, but he used them for his commercial interests. He taxed them very heavily for that privilege, but he set them up there. And similar things were happening for Jews in France and in Germany. There's a very famous letter written by the Archbishop of Mainz, in the year 1084, an important town on the Rhine River which is growing up. And the archbishop writes a letter and says, I wanted to take this little village and give it the dignity of a city. So I imported a colony of Jews to do trade. And I stuck them in their own quarter behind a high wall to protect them from the insolence of the mob. And I have the right to tax them, and they do business at my pleasure. That's how Jewish people got to the Christian lands. They were never embraced. They were tolerated up to a point. When did this point break down? It began to break down in a bad way in the year 1096. Let me tell you what happens in the year 1096. It's a terrible turning point for the Jews of Christendom. The Arab world, meanwhile, has been going through its own convulsive turmoils. One tribe after another comes in from Central Asia and conquers the local Arabs and becomes converted to Islam, and it goes on and on like that. One tribe that became very powerful in the 1000s in Turkey was a tribe called the Seljuk Turks. In the year 1071, they fought a huge battle against the Christian Byzantine Empire, and they utterly defeated the Byzantines, and the Byzantine Empire shrank to almost just the capital city of Constantinople and not much more. And the Seljuk Turks took over the land of Israel. The Byzantines had been controlling the land of Israel from around the 900s. In other words, they conquered it back from the Arabs, and they held it until the year 1071. Then the Seljuk Turks took it back. And they did not allow Christian pilgrims to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So that's going on for about a generation. In the year 1095, the Pope, whose name is Urban II, who, by the way, is in the middle of a big fight with the Holy Roman Emperor. There was all sorts of fights there. He preaches the crusade. He says, if you will take up the cross and go overseas, they called it outre-mer, overseas, go overseas and liberate Jerusalem from the control of the infidel, then God will forgive all your sins. And by the way, we'll also forgive all your debts, especially debts to Jews. So who signed up for the First Crusade? Very interesting. Generally, younger sons of nobles. And that is very telling. Let me explain why. If you have a farm and you have 3 sons and you give equal shares of the farm to each son gets 1/3 of a farm, right? That means each son only has 1/3 of your assets. Now, back then, land was the absolute basis of wealth. And why is that? It was not an industrial world, it was an agricultural world. More land means more crops means more money. And something else is important. What do horses live on? Hay, right? You need land for horses. Horses were the basis of the armies in the Middle Ages. Do you know why? They weren't the basis of the Roman army, right? Roman infantry, right? Conquered the whole world, Roman infantry. How come in the Middle Ages it's knights on horses? You saw this in Ivanhoe. Diddle-um, 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 right? How come it's horses? I'll tell you why. Anyone here ever ride a horse? I've never ridden a horse. You've ridden a horse. You've ridden a horse. Tell us, please, what is a stirrup?
What's a stirrup?
Stirrup. What's a stirrup? You put your feet in. Now imagine that you're a fighting man. The stirrup stabilizes you when you swing your sword so that you don't just fall off the horse.
I found this on the web. For what's the you put your feet in now that you're a fighting man? Check it out.
I guess Siri is listening to me. I don't want to check it out. Go away. Your big brother is watching, and so is little Siri. George Orwell was correct. Big brother is watching. It happened to me once before. It's very unnerving, I should tell you. Chaplain, it's worse if it happens in the middle of a sermon.
Hasn't happened to me yet.
Do you know what is the meaning of this verse? The meaning of this verse. Okay, back to warfare in the Middle Ages. If you have a stirrup, your cavalryman can defeat an infantryman because he has a stable platform to fight from his horse. That was an invention that made its way into Europe in the early Middle Ages. Probably was invented in some place like Kazakhstan or Mongolia or someplace like that where people are basically born riding horses, right? But gradually it made its way into Europe. The first battle where a Roman army was defeated by mounted cavalry was the Battle of Adrianople in the year 378, where the Byzantine army was defeated. And gradually the stirrup made its way all across Europe, which meant that the knight, who is a chevalier, right? He's on a horse. He's a caballero, right? He's on a horse. He becomes the most important soldier, and a knight means land so the horses can eat enough grass and hay to be able to serve in the army. So that's why land in the Middle Ages is the basis of wealth. So the father, who's a prince, dies. He wants to give all his land to his oldest son, right? Because that way the oldest son will be as powerful as the father was. He can make his way in this difficult world. What happens to the second son? He goes into the church. That's his career. And if it's a noble father, he's not going to be a humble parish priest. He'll be a bishop. And that's the way they did it in the Middle Ages. Okay, the bishops weren't bishops because they were just wonderful priests. They were bishops because they had the right last name, right? First families of Virginia became bishops, except that it wasn't Virginia, right? And what about the third son? As we say in Yiddish, Nebuch. What happens to he's a schlemazel, right? The third son is what we call a freelance. Today you think of freelance as a freelance photographer, a freelance journalist. Freelance meant his lance was free for someone to hire. That's what freelance means. So these freelancers were the ones who said yes to the Pope to go on crusade. Because if they conquer Syria and Israel and Lebanon, they can get estates of their own. So that's what fueled the crusade. I mean, some people wanted to liberate Jerusalem for religious reasons. Plenty of people wanted to get rich. It's like Americans going west on the Oregon Trail, right? They're going west in their prairie schooners because they were told they can get 160 acres. Right? Something similar. That movement produced terrible anti-Jewish riots in the cities up and down the Rhine River, Mainz, Speyer, Köln, those old Jewish cities with relatively large settlements. 500 Jewish people would be a lot for such a city. Massacred. So it was a time that reinforced for the Jews of Christendom that their tenure in Christian Europe is very shaky. Very shaky. What did the Jewish people do in response to that? They bound themselves closer to the kings. They said, you are our protection against the mob. You'll tax us as much as you want, but protect us. So in the Second Crusade, there was relatively less violence because the Jewish community was prepared for it. However, in the Third Crusade, while the Jews of France and Germany continued to protect themselves, there was no protection for the Jews of England. This crusading fever, let's kill the infidel. Remember they called the Jew an infidel in the movie. Let's kill the infidel meant a massacre of the Jews of York, England. So why did Walter Scott say Isaac of York? Why didn't he say Isaac of Lincoln, Isaac of Sheffield, Isaac of London? Any of the places he could have mentioned. Why did he say Isaac of York? Because York was infamous as the place where the Jewish community was slaughtered, massacred in 1189 at the beginning of the Third Crusade. So Richard the Lion-Hearted is not such a tzatzkila, not such a good guy. He was complicit in this. Now, he goes to the Holy Land, and that part of the novel is correct. He and the famous Muslim general Salah ad-Din fight to a draw. Neither one can defeat each other, and then Richard starts going home, and on his way home, he gets kidnapped by the Duke of Austria and held for an enormous ransom. That part of the movie is correct. Now, in the novel, Richard has already gotten back to England by the beginning of the novel. But in the movie, they make the gathering of the ransom a big part of the movie. So I want to talk about that for a minute. The Saxons are bringing in jewels, right? It's like a Viking horde, and they've got it on a table. They're trying to figure out what it's worth. Isaac of York comes in with a rolled up piece of paper. He says, "This is worth 100,000 marks." It's like walking in with a check for $1 million. How can you possibly have a check for $1 million? Well, it presupposes a very sophisticated economic world, right? If you have to collect 1 million marks in silver coins, you need chests that will fill up this entire room to get 1 million marks. But if you already have invented a paper money economy, which is what Arabs and Jews had each invented, then you can have a slip of paper which you sign, and it's worth 100,000 marks. So that part is correct, that because of their focus on being commercially useful to the kings, the Jews of Christian Europe had developed a level of commercial savvy that was equaled in Christian times only in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, there was a very famous house in Tuscany named Medici. Do you remember about the Cosimo de' Medici, Lorenzo de' Medici? You remember about them? They reinvented the kind of commerce that was common in Arab Middle Ages and Jewish Middle Ages, and they made it part of the Christian Middle Ages too. Interestingly enough, the Medici were bankers who loaned money out at interest to the popes, even though they were supposed to be forbidden to charge interest. But somehow they did, and they got away with it by saying, no, the laws in Deuteronomy against interest aren't against interest, they're against usury, which is excessively high interest, which is the way we stand by it today, thanks to the Medici. So anyway, that part is actually correct. But the thought that the Jews would work for King Richard because he was better for them than King John is a fantasy. It's a total fantasy. So why does this fantasy work in the movie? Here's my thought. When was the movie written? 1951, and filmed and aired in 1952. 1952, America is in the middle of the Cold War, right? This is really the point I want to make of analyzing the film as a historical document from 1952. Not analyzing Walter Scott's novel, but analyzing the film as a text from its own day and age. So I haven't read this is my theory. What does America want to prove in 1952? Our enemy is the Soviet Union. They're atheist, right? There's no God because Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses. Remember that? Communism is atheism. America is hospitable to religion. And as President Eisenhower famously said, in America, we like religion and we don't particularly care which one. So, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, you can be a good American. It's a little bit like a wonderful Norman Rockwell painting on the Saturday Evening Post cover. Freedom of religion for all of us. This one has his crucifix. This one has his rosary. This one has his Star of David. This one has, this symbol, that symbol, and we're all in it together. That's the American ideal of 1952. And that's what gets shown in two different ways in the film. First, it gets shown by the fact that the Jews and the Saxons are coming up with money for ransoming the Norman king, Richard I, which is a total fantasy. And yet, it makes sense in terms of what are they trying to prove in 1952 America. And the second lovely fantasy is the very end of the movie, right? Richard comes riding in with all of his, gazillions of crusaders, right? They all come riding in. Meanwhile, Wilfrid is barely hanging on, and Bois de Gilbert is bashing him with his mace and chain. Remember that? And he's barely holding on. And then at the very end, he does this very clever thing. He wraps the mace and chain around his axe. He pulls it down and chop, chop. And that's the end of Bois de Gilbert, right? At the very end of the battle. You think he's going to lose the whole time. And then at the very end, he has a jujitsu. He pulls it on. And just then, Richard comes riding in, and evil King John, I mean, he sneers with every single expression. You got to hate him. I mean, it's a face you got to hate, right? He's like the worst middle school teacher you ever had. Or maybe your drill instructor in the army, right? And ever so reluctantly, he kneels. Remember that? Now, Richard in real life wasn't such a nice guy. But Richard in this movie, you kneel as a house divided, you Saxons and you Normans, but you rise as one England. And that's how the movie ends, right? And then the score, like that. So it's a fantasy. It's a fantasy of e pluribus unum. From the many, we become one. And it's a fantasy that 1952 America really wanted to accept. So the movie was very popular in its day, not only because Elizabeth Taylor is quite beautiful, and Joan Fontaine ain't so bad either, right? And Robert Taylor is so handsome, right? And Henry Wilkinson is not so bad either, right? Not only because of that, not only because who doesn't love Robin Hood and his merry men? Who doesn't love good swashbuckling, I mean, Tom and Jerry did that all the time in there. Remember the Mouseketeers? Right? We all love good fight scenes. We all love good romances, right? But besides that, it stroked the country in a way that the country wanted to be told. You can all be good Americans. You can be a Saxon, you can be a Norman, you can be a Jew, you can be a Christian, a Protestant, a Catholic, as long as you salute the flag. My country, 'tis of thee. Right? So it's a movie of its time. It may not be our time today with all of our identity politics. That might be why it looks so dated. But if I may say in closing, all of the internecine struggles that you have in America today, this group against that group and that group against that group, maybe there's a vision there that it wouldn't hurt us to remember. So for all of its fantasy, I think there's something worth thinking about. Ivanhoe. Thank you.
Everybody's going to run around, so you have some questions.
Yes, happy to take questions. Sir.
All right, and as always, please wait until I come there with the microphone, and please tell us your name before you have your question.
Larry Bierman. Rabbi, I was wondering, did Sir Walter Scott purposely make Rebecca? I looked upon her, Jews are being slaughtered, and she said, I must give my heart, and so give herself up. I thought about the book of Esther.
Well, in the book of Esther, the young girl Hadassah becomes the queen of the Gentile king, Ahasuerus, right? Here, Rebecca ends up not marrying Wilfrid of Ivanhoe. She certainly falls for him, but at the end of the day, she knows that intermarriage is not her people's way. That would have been something that Shakespeare would have done in The Merchant of Venice, but she would have ceased to be a Jew at that point. Rebecca remains Jewish from start to finish, and so actually what happens is that she and Isaac go into exile again, because England is no place for them. That's actually what happens in the novel. They had left Spain because it was no place for them. This is what's called the legend of the wandering Jew. No rest for them until ultimately they found their way back home, which is 1948, which is the birth of Israel. That's a couple of movies from now. We're gonna see that as well. By the way, this is the last film that we're going to see that's before relatively modern times. Our next film is set in the year 1850, which to me feels pretty modern, at least compared to 1194, right? I mean, in 1850, they already had telegraphs. You know, think about it. They had railroads. So it's relatively. They had San Francisco, so it's relatively modern. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Maybe as a preview, we can come back to some question, but maybe as a preview, you would say something about the next movie that you're going to
The
watch.
Frisco Kid is a comedy, I should tell you. You know, after seeing The Masada is a very heavy documentary. And Ivanhoe is very dramatic, right? It has a happy-ish ending, but it's very dramatic. And there's tragic elements in it too, of course. But The Frisco Kid is a comedy. And true love wins out. And the rabbi learns how to be an American. And the bank robber learns how to be a mensch, a good man. So it's really a very sweet story about a scoundrelish bank robber portrayed by a very young Harrison Ford and a kind of a ne'er-do-well, schleppy rabbi, and somehow they bring out the best in each other. It's a very, very sweet story. Who's the lady? I don't remember the name of the actress because she's not central to the story. It's really a bromance story. But he does get the girl. Okay. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? All right, I'll come your way. I'll go around here. You would raise your hand one more time. All right, and please tell us your name.
My name is Tom Brightfield. You had a very, very interesting explanation of why the Jewish people were so successful to survive as a group, with the being able to conduct
In the Middle Ages,
that they
yeah.
did between the different other civilizations, so to speak. So they were very financially a successful group.
It doesn't mean they were wealthy. It means they knew how to survive.
They were able to
Yeah.
survive financially. At the Holocaust, was that an issue that the Nazis wanted to get rid of all the Jews?
Well, in the Holocaust, it was fueled by absolute racism, such as you do not see in Ivanhoe. In Ivanhoe, the prejudice is religious. But if Rebecca of York would have become a Christian, they would have taken her down off the pyre and saved her and treated her as a wonderful, precious soul saved in the nick of time. Whereas for the Nazis, if you had one Jewish grandparent, it was off to the gas with you.
Pure racism.
Pure racism, right. Now, something else about the Jews of England. They had an unhappy end. Within 1 century of this story, so you have King John, his son, King Henry III, and his son, King Edward I. Did you ever see the movie Braveheart? King Edward I is the nasty guy who chucks the guy out the window. In Braveheart, he's a nasty, nasty guy. King Edward I banished the Jews, expelled the Jews from England for a very simple reason. John and Henry III had taxed them and overtaxed them so heavily that they had nothing left to give. When they had nothing left to give, they were no more use to them. So King Edward kicked them out. Now, most of them went to France, because remember, King Edward also had a lot of territory in France. English kings owned a lot of France until the 100 Years' War between the 1300s and the 1400s. Remember Joan of Arc? She's on the French side. The French finally won the 100 Years' War. By 1453, the English are kicked out of France. And then the French also expelled the Jews. And the Spanish also expelled the Jews. There were no Jews in Western Europe until the 1500s when they began coming back. So England was a precursor, the first country to kick its Jews out. So, you know, it looks like everybody's happy and they're all living together and everybody's beautiful, but that's not the true story of the Jews of England, unfortunately. When did Jews get back to England? 1650s, under Oliver Cromwell. It took that long till the Jews came back to England. Here's a very interesting and surprising story. North America was a bunch of 13 English colonies, right? Actually more than 13, there was Canada also, right? But we had 13 English colonies here in America from New Hampshire down to Georgia. And Jewish people were allowed to be naturalized in them before they could be naturalized in England itself. So in the 1750s, there was a bill in the English Parliament called the Jew Bill, which said, since Jews are allowed to be naturalized in the king's colonies in the Western Hemisphere, they should be allowed to be naturalized and be subjects of King George here in England. King George II, as it happens, not George III. And the bill failed. English Parliament didn't want to let Jews live in England, even in the 1750s, even though they'd been living there quietly for 100 years. But, you know, didn't believe in birthright citizenship, so to speak. You know about birthright citizenship? It's a big deal today in America. I'll tell you, I learned something that's a little bit scary. My wife's parents were Holocaust refugees. They came to this country from Poland, well, actually from a displaced persons camp in Germany, a place called Bad Reichenhall. Do you know where Bad Reichenhall is? Not all that far from München, right? And my father-in-law worked for the American military public health administration in München. But every Friday he took the train back to Bad Reichenhall and spent the weekend with his wife and daughter, my wife's older sister. So they came to this country in late 1949, and they became naturalized American citizens in March of 1955. I just learned that it wasn't until March of 1955, and my wife was born in February of 1955. So she was born in America to Polish citizens. So is she a birthright citizen? Is she going to get deported by the current administration? Uh-oh. Oy vey. I hope not, I think not, but I'm not completely satisfied. Isn't that something? Yeah. Okay, maybe one more question?
Going once? Going twice?
All right, lovely seeing you. Judy has the last word.
Next dates of the movie and of the lecture.
Okay, next month is screwed up, date-wise, so pay good attention to what I'm telling you. The movie will be shown on Wednesday, 11/5. Wednesday, November 5th. The lecture will be on a Wednesday, 11/19. There's 2 weeks in there. Okay? So plan to see the movie on the 5th of November. And we'll try to keep you updated after that so you don't forget.
The Frisco Kid.
Frisco Kid that he
Yes.
mentioned. So the
one-
comic Frisco Kid.
That we've
The
been talking about recently.
Frisco, as in San Francisco. Frisco.
Okay.
Not the cooking oil. That's Crisco. Friskies is cat food, yes.
We're really going around the bend tonight. It's good to see all of you. We thank you so much for coming and
Always a pleasure.
being with us.
Always a pleasure. Bob, how are you?